Welcome to Global Supply Chain Outlook 2026, Pressures and Opportunities for Accessories Brands. We're excited to welcome Roman Ramirez from Gemini Shippers, who's going to lead this conversation today. This will be a great opportunity for you to ask questions. I'm sure learn some things along the way. We're going to provide an up-to-date view of the global ocean freight market, variable rate dynamics, capacity trends, and the impact of ongoing disruptions across trade lanes. So that is a major topic that I think everyone will really benefit from hearing about. And Roman is an expert in this field, having been with Gemini, which is a leading freight shipping association. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Roman Ramirez, the Director of Commercial Strategy, an AC member from Gemini Shippers. We will have Q&A at the end. This presentation will probably last about 45 minutes. However, there will be pauses along the way. If you want to ask questions along the way, that's great, or just pop any questions you have into the chat and we will address those. So, Roman, I turn it over to you. Welcome.
Yes. Thank you very much, Irene, and thank you to the Accessories Council. And yes, as Irene mentioned, we're open for questions. So as we go through the slides and then we're covering various topics and I'm showing the slides, feel free to pop any of those questions in the chat or chime in. Much better to address them at that time versus at the end when it's a good opportune time to cover them. So just give me 1 second here. I'm gonna swap my screen and show my slides. Okay, you guys can see that okay?
Yes, all good.
Sounds good. Let me just swap Zoom and we're good to go. All right. Well, first and foremost, I do want to thank the Accessories Council for having me. Thank you, Karen and Irene, for the partnership that we've had with the Shippers Association, the Gemini Shippers Association that's had with the Accessories Council that's going on for the better part of a decade now. And of course, a big thank you for all attendees and supporters of both the Accessories Council and Gemini. Now, with that said, there is one housekeeping item I have to cover. Since we are in a group discussion and we're talking about trade and we want to maintain high standards and compliance, and also to make our attorneys happy as well, I do have to make a quick note. And I promise this is the most boring slide in my deck because I do have to read this word for word, but it is the only one like it. So today's session is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice. The views I will express today are that of my own and may not reflect those of the association or the Accessories Council. This session, while for intended audiences, is public in nature, and we ask all participants, including questions, to avoid discussing competitively sensitive information in accordance with antitrust guidelines. Now that that's off, now that that's out of the way, I'll formally introduce myself. Oop, may have hit. There you go. And I will admit, I normally don't like talking about myself, but in this case, it does help explain why I'm here presenting to the group and give our audience an update as well. And so, as I already mentioned, I'm Roman Ramirez, the Director of Commercial Strategy for Gemini Shippers Association. My background is in ocean freight. I spent the majority of my career, my professional career, at various ocean carriers, where I worked all in a commercial sort of higher level position up until 3 years ago when I joined Gemini in my current capacity. And just to give everyone some background on the Gemini Shippers Association, it is the longest running and largest shippers association in existence. By definition, a shippers association is a not-for-profit ocean freight procurement group. The concept was formalized under the Shipping Act of 1984, and the concept was intended for North American companies in an effort to help them improve their competitiveness in ocean freight costs. It's a very similar structure to a trade association, much like the Accessories Council, but in our case, we get involved operationally with the member companies and mainly on the ocean freight contracting side. We also have a sister company that is a supply chain and transportation consulting firm called Blue Spark. This group helps large importers with analytical insights, industry knowledge, and structural guidance across all transport modes. It is with their insight and expertise that helps us deliver informed analysis on the industry and practical perspectives on trade developments and forces that shape the global supply chain to audiences much like yourselves, the members of the Accessories Council. Now, we're going to move on what I like to call the new constant, and that is global disruption. First, we're going to cover the timeline. There's just a few items here. It happens to be, at least for our industry, a recurring theme, and that is disruption. This timeline shows just some of the disruptions that we've seen over the last decade or so. And as you can tell, we've had quite a bit going on. I'll be highlighting a few just to spark some of the memories for those of you that have been impacted or know or aware of some of these, right? Going back a little over 10 years, in 2014 and 2015 was the ILWU negotiations that sparked a nationwide port disruption. For those of you not aware, the ILWU is the Western Coast Union that operates all the ports on the West Coast there. Um, Moving on, the following year was the Hanjin bankruptcy, one of the larger ocean carriers that went bankrupt and had an impact on the industry as a whole. And then, believe it or not, the year after 2017 and 18 was the first round of the Trump tariffs. That caused nationwide changes, just the way we do business and how we import products. We'll skip the 2019 IMO. That's primarily more from a fuel perspective. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But the one that everyone saw and everyone was impacted by globally was COVID, right? Sparked in 2019, saw a bigger impact in 2020. And for the next 2 to 3 years, we really had a change in the way business was run that impacts supply chains, that impact imports and exports as well. Just a couple of years after that, we had some further lockdowns and additional impacts with the ILWU, a sharp increase in goods and services demand as well. So we got a huge rush of cargo as well as a situation in Ukraine. In 23 and 24, I'll talk in detail the Panama Canal drought and what kind of impact that had, as well as the Israel and Hamas conflict. And for those of you that remember, out in Baltimore, the bridge was struck by a container ship and it collapsed, caused a pretty big supply chain issue here domestically in the U.S., but it hit media worldwide. And again, a big impact for us. Last year, we had another smaller strike, albeit much shorter on the ILA, so that's the East Coast Union. We'll talk about the Red Sea disruption there. It started a little bit before that, but we'll talk about what that is. New tariffs announcements. We'll go into a little bit of detail on tariffs, not too much, but we'll talk through that. And then more recently this year, the Iran war, the activity around the Strait of Hormuz, more tariffs, more disruptions around the Red Sea, and others. And so nonetheless, this is only a visual of some of the things as your company's importers and exporters have faced over the years. And while you may not be aware of it all, it certainly has made an impact on all of our businesses. And so what we're going to do next is cover some of the more recent events and impacts to our supply chain. First, I want to cover the U.S. China trade, just some uncertainty around the tariffs and the most recent change around the minimis program. So tariffs, the big piece here is tariffs are not purely economic, right? Every importer is feeling that impact. The big piece for the American companies or the importers here is trying to figure out a solid landed cost for your product, right? You need to ensure you're protecting your margins and tariff announcements. Tariffs have been pulled back, tariffs have been changed. And now, just last week, I saw some companies getting refunds on those tariffs. And so that's a major impact to the way we've done business ever since the announcements of those. It's a pretty significant and quick pivot that companies have had to do. And not just from an import perspective, but also from a sourcing perspective as well. And so folks have tried to work around the tariffs, make some changes to minimize the impacts there, as well as changing terms, right? Some companies that have imported according to FOB terms have made a change to CIF or DDP terms, and now making the shift back. But that is something that has impacted overall trade volumes and the way importers are bringing their products in. The other big impact here that I want to cover is the minimis program, right? That's something it's been around for a while. For those of you not familiar, that's the import of products under the value of $800. Previously, they were coming in duty free, and now that program has ceased. And so any of those products and companies that were importing those on a much smaller scale, right? More at the parcel level, individual package, they're now going to face the tariffs and duties related to importing those products. And so that involves some direct costs and compliance burdens as well. And so some of those companies that were involved in that are now relooking at their strategy from a warehousing perspective, from a consolidation point at origin perspective, and their fulfillment models. And that is something that we are going to see a change. We will see impact, at least in containerized shipping, primarily because some of those models will go more towards the traditional consolidation into a container import and then distribution here at destination, whereas previously it may have moved at an individual package level via air freight. And so that is something that we are going to see and deal with as we work through that program. All right. Then we're going to look at which is arguably the largest operational risk in global shipping, and that is disruptions around the Red Sea. Now, this has been going on for quite some time now. I know on the timeline it showed, I think it was 2025 or whatnot, but this is going well over 2 years now. The disruption and activity around the Red Sea there had been around a while, but it really wasn't into effect in cargo shipping until the container ships were being attacked. And so once that took place, the ocean carriers really encountered some very large security threats, right? Not just from their own operations, their own ships, the safety of the seafarers, right? The crews that are on these ships, as well as the cargo that they were carrying. This is all a significant threat. And really, the impact from a cost perspective has been on insurance, right? It has driven up the insurance, and it's an indirect cost for all the cargo owners on those ships, but a direct cost for the ocean carriers directly. The other major impact has all revolved around transits. It's a little bit more, I'll like to say normal now, but the delay in transit of going around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, versus going through the Red Sea and passing through the Suez Canal is pretty significant. Initial estimates at that time was they were thinking it was going to be 10 to 14 days. The reality is closer to 15 to 20 days. And so those delays in transits means your products out at sea versus out on the shelves, right? The costs that are implied based on those longer transit times. And on the ocean carrier side, it's the longer routes. The longer the route, the more fuel they're burning. And that is a significant cost lever in their operations. And of course, what that is one of the direct costs that many importers faced was the increase in ocean freight costs, whether directly on the surcharges or as the overall cost as the container lines were moving across that route. And so that is a major supply chain impact that we will continue to see. We actually don't see this situation improving in the short term. This is a much longer term problem. And we hope, I think, for everyone's sake, that that improves. But as we've tried to clear the passage and go through that Red Sea again, we've seen time and time again that there's disruptions. Anytime there's a smaller number of ships going through there, it's much easier to spot them versus a larger set of container ships. And we'll talk about that situation in another example. The next disruption I want to cover is the more recent one, and that is the one currently happening around the Iran war, and specifically for us in the shipping world, that's the Strait of Hormuz. I call this a defining disruption, and that is because it's two faceted. It's one on the cargo ship, which I'll talk through, but another impact, which is probably a larger scale impact on the global economy, and that's the supply of oil. Now, talking container ships, when we take a step back and look at this at a global scale, it's actually quite small. Look at that, looking at that statistic at the bottom there. It's only impacting 1.4% of the global fleet. However, when you look at that at a regional perspective, so that's imports and exports going into and out of the Middle East, it's a much, much bigger problem, right? It's basically sees 95% of the transits through that strait. And so for cargo ships trying to move through there into those destinations, they have not been able to. And so that's a major impact to those local economies. And for any businesses that are importing from there or exporting to there, I'm sure some of you are impacted and asking yourselves, where is my cargo? If it was en route, if it was on water, currently being stranded because the container ships are not going through there. We talked about the insurance premiums, right? The war risk premium surge is currently estimated at 300%. Again, some explicit costs and some implicit costs there for the importers. Um, and then one major piece that I want to put your focus on is in the lower left-hand corner of the slide, that core concept there, and that is the impact on oil. So for every $5 increase in oil price per barrel, that equates to about a $35 to the West Coast or a $60 to the East Coast increase in cost per container. And so you can imagine when the price of oil per barrel increases by 10, 15, $20, it's a pretty significant impacts to every single importer and exporter across the world. And this impact is seen globally. We'll talk about that a little bit further in the slides, but that is something that everybody is seeing, right? Everything from the fuel pumps for our cars to the marine traffic container ships. One big piece and statistic that I want everyone to be aware of, that's the lower right-hand corner. Singapore is one of the major hubs for bunkering or fueling for maritime vessels. And they used to supply over 50% of the fuel going into Singapore from this region. And so that has caused some congestion. Very, very similar to your lines at Costco when you go to get gas, right? You're sitting in a line, everyone's waiting to get gas. It's a similar situation with the vessels there. They're sitting in line in Singapore. It is causing some congestion. It is also changing the strategies for the ocean carriers, trying to avoid bunkering in that location. And so it is a dynamic that we have to work around. I'd say minimal operational risk from the cargo importer perspective. Just the price is the biggest piece there. All right. And then the next network disruption that we have seen and experienced before is actually a climate risk, and that is the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal operates from the natural rainfall and fresh water from the Gatun Lake that's there in between the locks, right? It relies on the water to move those vessels through those locks and raise those vessels at sea level to the level of the lake and then back down on the other side. And so anytime there's a risk for drought or an impact to the available water supply for those locks, there will be an impact to transits via the Panama Canal. That is something that we saw a severe impact in 2023 and 2024. It limited vessel capacity, it created congestion in the area, and it created auction transit slots, right? Container vessels typically were given priority. However, that wasn't the case for all vessels, right? There was cruise ships, there was fishing vessels, other boats that were running through the locks there had to actually go on an auction to purchase a slot and pass through those locks. And so that was a pretty big impact for other industries as well. Um, the current status, the traffic has improved, sort of back to normal from a vessel count perspective. They've improved the operations of it as well, and so there's a little bit less risk. But at the end of the day, a major drought like we saw a few years ago, we will see an impact there through the Panama Canal. And that is something that we always have to be mindful of and watch out for. So, I'm going to pause there. We'll take a macro look, a macro view, but I'm going to pause here and see if there's any questions on a few of the topics that I've covered so far.
Anybody want to put anything in the chat or feel free to just unmute yourself to ask the question? I'm amazed we're getting anything on these vessels with everything going on out there.
Yeah,
This
we'll
is
talk about
wild.
that a little bit.
My gosh. Okay. Yeah. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, yeah, it's a big impact for sure.
Wow. Um, no questions? Okay. Well, let's keep on moving.
We'll keep chugging along here.
All right.
And now what I want to show you next is a live global map of it's marine traffic. It's actually a service. It's a free service. Anybody can go on to marine traffic and track vessels. But what you're seeing here is a global view of all cargo ships around the world. You can do this for oil tankers and other vessels around. This utilizes the AIS technology. It's sort of like a GPS for our vessels, but it is a live map of what's where each vessel is around the world. And what I want everyone to focus on is the flow of vessel traffic, right? I'm going to turn my laser pointer here. Think of these as your ocean gateways or highways, so to say, for marine traffic. You see these very heavily congested routes going around Africa. We're seeing directly the impacts of the disruptions in the Red Sea, which is this area, this region right here. It's probably hard to tell on your computer screens, but there's only a handful of vessels transiting through the Red Sea there. Not very many. The vast majority, and I'm talking hundreds of thousands, if not thousands of vessels going around the Cape of Good Hope. That is a lane that is ever since those disruptions have taken place, cargo ships have been moving around that, and that's why the delays in transit is such a big impact to the global supply chain. The other situation I described was the Panama Canal, right? You see this flow of traffic of cargo ships moving up and down the west coast of North America, Mexico here through the Panama Canal. And from here, it sort of splits off to the U.S. East Coast and the Caribbean, and then the South America East Coast as well. This trade lane used to not be as heavy, those going around Africa directly to mainly Brazil, but that's South America. That is also a trade lane that has become more congested due to the closures of the Red Sea. And you can't see it too much, but this area here is the Strait of Hormuz, the Arabian Gulf there. And the last few stranded vessels are still there. But that's the disruption that we discussed earlier. And the reason I talked into a little bit more detail the prior disruptions and the situations around those locations is because those are our global choke points, right? The Panama Canal, a disruption there is a choke point. The option of going all the way around South America is not as feasible as it is with other parts of the world. The Suez Canal, we're living that right now. That ongoing political disruption there is causing all the vessels, the vast majority of the vessels to go around Africa. The Strait of Hormuz is another example, right? That one's a little bit more landlocked. It's basically going into the Gulf and then back out. But then we hope that that is a short-term situation. The impact of the oil supply is far too large on the global economy. And so we expect that to not nearly go as long like the Red Sea, for example. But there's the other, possible situation that has grown strategic concern is the Strait of Malacca. And so I'm going to go back to this map here. What I'm referring to is this area here, the Strait of Malacca that basically passes through Malaysia and Indonesia is a major strait for the Asia trade. Singapore is at the very lower end of Malaysia there. I talked about the bunkering stations there, one of the largest in the world. And so the Strait of Malacca is another potential choke point. However, geographically does have some relief, right? The vessels can transit around and still access key Asia markets there. But it is something that has been of growing concern and something that we have to watch out from our perspective. And so these global choke points, they represent a single point of failure in global routing. And so for importers and ocean carriers alike, those diversified routing strategies are really no longer an option. They are essential to risk management because at any point in time, some of those major ones can shut down and cause a major disruption. Now, I'm going to move on to the same map, but for two entirely different reasons. So we're looking at the global map here. Again, same layout, but what we're looking here in red is the oil reserves around the world, separated by country. And then in yellow are rare earth element deposits around the world. First, I want to focus on the Western Hemisphere, um, and highlight this country here. This is Venezuela. This is the single largest oil reserve in the world that is managed by or controlled by one country. It's a little over 300 billion barrels of oil, and that feeds major oil markets throughout the world. And as you know, we've had some activity sparked by our administration down in Venezuela. And that is one of the main reasons there that the control of that oil and what's happening with that oil is impacting, if you guys recall my first slide, the U.S. and China trade dynamic. And so essentially, the major supplier for China is Venezuela. And that is also a choke point from oil perspective. The largest region of oil reserves is the Middle East. That's an obvious one. Most folks are aware of that. But that is controlled by various countries, right? That's why you see the highest concentration here. As a whole, the region does have the largest deposits, but they are controlled separately by countries. And so this is where the Strait of Hormuz, very concentrated in that region, has the biggest impact for oil tankers, right? Yeah, you start squeezing the oil supply from those two regions, both Venezuela and the Middle East, and China is now much larger risk in obtaining the oil that is required to run their local economies as well. And so the other piece I want you to focus on is look at the inverse relationship of oil reserves as opposed to rare earth element deposits. You'll notice where there are oil reserves, there's lack of rare earth element deposits and vice versa. So you'll see east coast of India, a lot of rare earth elements, same with Asia. On this side, Northern Europe, again, you don't see too many large oil reserves there. And so that is why you see a lot of media around that. Our current administration those are two major targets of control. And those are two major points of impact on the global economies. And as you can see in these purple routes here, they follow the same routes that cargo ships follow. So the same choke points that we have with container ships are the same choke points that we have with importing and exporting of these products as well. And so it is a major impact to the global supply chain and something that is on everybody's radar and a major impact. And again, this is at every level, down from the gas pumps when you fill up your car to truckers to air freight to ocean freight. It's an impact across the board, and we're all feeling it right now. Now, I'm going to take a pause before I pivot to my next topic, where we'll focus a little bit more on ocean freight, and we'll see if there's any questions from the audience at this time. I don't see any in the chat there, Irene, so if anyone has some, feel free to speak up.
I have so many thoughts from these maps. I'm studying them like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize Venezuela had that many barrels of oil. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it's a huge supply, and that's why it's
Yeah.
such a major change when we had
Yeah.
some activity around there, the presidency there.
Yeah, no, I definitely I'm learning a lot here tonight. Okay, any questions? Okay, we will continue.
All right. Well, we'll brighten up the room a little bit. Enough doom and gloom
I was going to
for
say this
later.
is pretty heavy, yeah, but all good information for sure.
Yes, yes. We're gonna switch gears and move over to ocean freight here. And so the first, similar to it, like I started with the timeline. Here's a timeline on the industry consolidation from an ocean freight perspective, right? This goes for a much larger timeline. We're going dating back to almost 20 years now. The main thing I want to highlight here is the changes in logos that you see on this timeline. First and foremost, there are a lot of logos that are no longer. Starting from the left, right, we have Delmas, CSAV, China Shipping, Hanjin obviously was a collapse, UASC. The Japanese lines that you're seeing there in 2017 here, that consolidation now into aptly named One or ONE. Hamburg Süd no longer as well. And so those are a lot of the changes, not too different from the airlines, right? There's a lot of consolidation that took place. I'd say the ocean carrier industry is about a decade in arrears from the airlines, and so we're still seeing quite a bit of M&A activity. Um, but the other piece I want to highlight is this gap here between 19 or 2019 and 2025, and that is the formation of these mega alliances. Now, an alliance, actually formerly known as vessel sharing agreements, for those of you that are not aware, is essentially just like the airlines, right? They're running the same exact routes across different carriers, but at any point in time, it could be one of the carrier's vessels. For example, the Ocean Alliance, it could be the same route, it's the same service, it's a weekly service. One week it could be a CMA ship, the next week Costco, the next week Evergreen, and the next week OCL, all on the same network. And so this alliance structure or VSAs, the vessel sharing agreements, it's not a new thing. They existed before, but this is really where there was a lot of consolidation. What you're seeing here is essentially the top 10 carriers formed into just three alliances. And what that does is it creates a different dynamic and reduces the shipper leverage because rather than looking at this as 10 options for an importer or an exporter, you have three options because it's the same network. It's just a matter of who operates that ship, who operates those terminals, and the type of service that you get across these carriers. And so that is a significant change in procurement models from an importer perspective primarily. And so these alliances and consolidation are obviously impacting the world and how the world operates, right? 85% of the world's cargo is moved via container ships. And so that is a major impact there and something that we have to be aware of. We'll talk about this last possible consolidation here of Zim a little bit in a couple slides here. So moving on, I'm going to focus a little bit more short term, right? This is the landscape of today. And as you can see, the options are not much different, right? So the two larger carriers, Maersk and MSC, split up. MSC now being an independent. And then Maersk joined up with Hapag-Lloyd, that was previously in another alliance, and they formed aptly named Gemini Cooperation. Not related to the Gemini Shippers Association, but yes, we did get a lot of outreach related to that and still get some confusion around that. The Ocean Alliance, for the most part, unchanged. There's four members here, but you'll see on the main east-west trade lanes, their market share is pretty significant. And then you have the Premier Alliance, which is essentially the previous alliance without Hapag-Lloyd. Now, on the independent side, you'll see still a decent sized market share for main east-west trade lanes, but the majority of that is under MSC, and we'll talk about that in a bit. We'll also cover Zim, the One High, Matson, SM lines of the world, the more niche carriers on a smaller scale outside of the top 10, but still a major player, at least for the Trans-Pacific market. We're going to focus, or I guess give you another view of that consolidation. This is your list of your top 10 ocean carriers on a global scale, right? So this is moving beyond feeder networks and east-west trade lanes. This is overall capacity. what I want everyone to be aware of, and as a reminder for those that do know, are these individual little flags next to the ocean carrier company logos. Every carrier on this list, which is again, it's the top 10 and controls about 85% share of the global market, has a strong historical and administrative ties to their country of origin. And so that's something that we constantly have to be aware of. From a U.S. perspective, a little scary that the U.S. flag is nowhere on the top 10. And so that's something that, again, our current administration is on their radar and wanting to make some changes to get back to that. A very difficult thing to do because of the so much capital. It's a very capital intensive industry. And so we'll see if that takes place. But at the end of the day, a lot of these carriers do have those ties with their countries. And so that's something that we need to be mindful of. I do want to focus on MSC. MSC, the number one carrier by far, you'll see it's over 2 times larger than Costco, the fourth largest carrier in the world, and a far difference between number two, Maersk, and three, CMA. They're a little over 7 million TEU in capacity. They were the first container ship line to reach 1,000 container ships in operation. That's both owned and chartered. And so it's that line there. It really we've seen some unprecedented scale and growth there with them. It's one of the younger container ship lines on this graphic here. They started in 1970. They weren't global until 1980, but since 1980, they've only trended up and at a much faster pace than any other container ship line. We'll see if MSC's growth continues on the same trend or if the ROI won't make sense. We'll talk about that growth and the impact on the industry as a whole in a bit. But I want to talk a little bit about a possible acquisition between Hapag-Lloyd and Zim. So Hapag-Lloyd is currently the fifth largest, Zim being the 10th largest. The combination would not shift that in any way. Hapag would still be the fifth largest. However, it would create a different dynamic in terms of network and serviceability by that carrier. So Zim is a pretty strong carrier for the East Coast, and so that'll bring some of that strength to Hapag if that merger and acquisition happen. However, just this last week, there was an announcement in the media that an Israeli investment group has since offered a bid at a higher price than Hapag-Lloyd. And so while we were thinking this was probably the final bidder, that news certainly has changed that. And back to my point about the countries of origins for these carriers, Zim is a major strategic company for the country of Israel. And so even if the merger between Hapag and Zim takes place, they will keep Israel whole and maintain Israeli-based operations there in Haifa, as well as some of the vessel ownership being flagged via Israel. And we could expect other global trades to be managed and operated via Hapag-Lloyd. But still more to come on that. That's going to be a long decision. We don't see anything happening at the near term. In fact, even Hapag and Zim's decision, they were pushing that out towards the end of the year. But we'll be interested in hearing what comes of that. All right. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit high level on the supply as a whole. We're currently in a bit of a strange market. The ocean freight industry is at an overcapacity. However, it is being absorbed by some of these disruptions that we mentioned before, right? The biggest one being the Red Sea diversions. Those longer transits take more vessels to run as they try to maintain weekly services for the various locations. And so a loop that would normally take, say, 10 vessels now requires 14, so to say. And so that additional capacity is being absorbed by those disruptions. The order book ratio is still quite high at over 36%. So that just means those new builds are going to continue to be deployed, and we're going to get in a further ingestion of capacity in the market as a whole. That order book is measured at currently a little over 12 million TEU. And so you can imagine the mathematics between 12 million TEU versus 2.5 million currently being absorbed by disruption. There is still a severe overcapacity coming into the market over the next number of years. The ocean carriers made quite a bit of money during those COVID years and a few years after, and so they invested in their fleet, and that's where a lot of those deployments and new vessels are being built. And so we will see how long these disruptions last and what kind of impact the new deployments and new vessels coming into market versus the disruptions play. But we know at a long term, it is heavily weighted on a supply being larger than demand. And so for the ocean carriers, what they're gonna experience is some pressures on the pricing side, right? Anytime that supply and demand curve moves over to the one side, we see an impact on prices, and as well as the on-time vessel reliability, right? We have more ships or less ships. However that changes, it will change the transits and stability of those transits. On the shipper side, really the big piece here is, and key message for importers is to build stability wherever you can, right? As long as you can build a long-term strategy and have some flexibility built in there, it should be okay. And we'll see how that market changes as these disruptions sort of calm down. But we do, again, long term, we'll see that shift. All right. I'm going to pause one more time for any questions, if there are any.
Probably everybody like me is still absorbing all of this fantastic information. But
Yep. Good,
anybody,
good. If not, we'll move on. A couple other topics, kind of changing gears and looking at the domestic market. One of the big major changes that we can possibly see is the merger of two major railroads. That's the Union Pacific and the Norfolk Southern. Um, this would create the first transcontinental railroad that would span basically from the West Coast to the East Coast. And it is a significant change. It will be a highly contentious decision from a regulatory standpoint. In fact, the initial application was declined because of the lack of the details. An updated application has been submitted, and we're actually waiting here in the next couple of weeks. We should get some results on whether the Surface Transportation Board accepts that application and puts it in the formal review. And so it is going to require some regulatory hurdles in order for that to take place, but it is a major deal from the domestic market. I do want to show you what that looks like, just so you get a visual. On the left-hand side, or I guess the western part, as you look down the Mississippi River, is the Union Pacific Rail Network. And on the eastern side of the Mississippi, there is the NS network. And so you can imagine those two combined, one transcontinental railroad network, and their competitors. There's not many, right? On the West Coast, it's the UP and the BNSF, and they have similar networks, so it's not huge there. And I'm talking major Class One railroads, so we'll see what that looks like. On the East Coast, it's NS, what you see there, and the CSX. What you don't see are the Canadian controlled railroads. That's the CN and the CPKC. So they do feed into the US from the north, right? Vessels will discharge in Vancouver, for example, rail across and come down into the Midwest. So there is some impacts there, but this is what the landscape of that merger could possibly look like. Now, talking a little bit about the pros and cons. So, the arguments in favor is that transcontinental network. You get coast-to-coast coverage from the what would be the newly formed company. That would be an increase in transit times, less interchanges, right? Today, to go from one coast to the other requires an interchange at some point. That's a movement of a container from one railroad network to the other. And while that will still continue, really what we're talking about is control of the operator from one operator to the other. And so that would be a seamless handoff across the network. And then also on the technology front, Union Pacific slightly with more and innovative technology from the competitive landscape that we can see some improvements there. Now, from the shipper concerns, the big piece with any sort of consolidation, especially at this scale, is the control of rates, right? You'll have one transcontinental network versus multiple, and how those pricing levers move from one way to the other is it's a major deal there. And so that is something that is of concern, not just for shippers, but also the regulatory authorities as well. This will offer, at this point, we're looking at less service flexibility, right? You'll have one operator. And so the importers, or I guess shippers, will have to work with that one operator across that network versus a couple different options if you were working across those. And then in any case, any sort of market concentration, monopoly situation, we do have that competitive landscape. But whether it is approved or not, this merger does reflect a broader trend of consolidation, like I mentioned in other industries, in this case across the U.S. freight transportation network. And so it is a very similar topic that we've covered in the past.
Interesting. You saw there was a question that popped into the chat, right?
Very interesting, Larry.
The one from
Market
Pete.
share.
Yeah, of the
Yeah,
ship.
so I don't know the number of or the percentage of market share across these rail networks, but it is pretty split, right? On the West Coast between the Union Pacific and the BNSF, and then on the East Coast between the NS and CSX, right? So it is a major deal if, even though the numbers aren't this way, if it was 25% across all, this would basically be 50% of that, the market share. But again, those numbers aren't that clean. It does differ. I'd have to look at and provide you what that looks like.
I guess I'm surprised this hasn't already happened, in some way, shape, or form in all these years, I guess because I've seen in like upstate New York, especially too, and there are the long cargo trains that go on and you're stopped, and I just think those are everywhere and going across the country, but they're really not, like not.
Yeah, there is. Like there are quite a few regional lines that obviously you're not seeing here. These are the major networks, and again, only limited to Class One railroads.
Mhm.
But even then, there has been quite a bit of consolidation in that industry as well. And so it's not unlike the other transportation networks. We have
Okay.
seen that, but again, that's not indicative of this map, primarily focusing on the major Class One railroads.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Okay.
All right. A big piece also for importers, especially in the fashion and apparel world, is the regulatory compliance, both from a sustainability standpoint and compliance, right? On the climate side, environmental initiatives, emissions, and climate regulations are continuing. For those of you that know that term, CBAM, know how much work it takes to be compliant with that within that regulation. Emissions reporting is a very popular topic and continuing to grow. For those that do business in California, I'm sure, or at least I hope you're aware of those two state bills, State Bill 261 and 253, related to climate disclosures. While enforcement has been pushed back, the implementation has not. And so need to be aware of those types of things to make sure your company is in compliance. Another major update on the global scale is the International Maritime Organization Net Zero Framework. They just met a couple weeks ago. They did defer that, so they are looking at a global network for emission reductions from a fuel perspective. But they did move forward on other aspects in this situation. The world's largest emission control area in Europe enforcing a 0.10% sulfur cap on the fuel and emissions there. So that is something that we're going to continue to see and will continue to grow not just domestically but internationally as well. And then on the compliance side, it's no different, right? For those of you that dealt with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, extended producer responsibilities, some of those regulations are coming on board. I know the packaging EPR frameworks, I think, are already approved or proposed by 13 states. Those are the types of things that your compliance officers need to be aware of. And really, from an importer perspective, the thought process is that it's really no longer optional. It is a condition of the market, and companies that are prepared now will be better positioned competitively in the future as well. We know these regulations are going to continue and expand to other regions like Asia, Latin America, India, subcon. And so we're going to see more and more of this. So those companies are now utilizing that as a competitive lever as well. One thing I want to touch on is technology and specifically AI, right? This is something that has become a very popular topic. It is growing. We're comparing the use of AI and development of AI similar to the internet, where it's scaling at a very fast pace, and companies that are utilizing that technology as well as other technologies are really better positioning themselves. And so, from that perspective, at least leaders in the supply chain world, we're providing the guidance of and keeping that saying in the back of your mind of innovate or die, right? You want to make sure you're looking at these technologies. It doesn't have to be AI, just any technologies in general that help improve decision making, utilize data for those decisions, improve forecasting, and utilizing some of those tools for efficiencies at a larger scale. So that is something that needs to continue. And for your companies, you want to continue to push that from your end. All right. We'll touch on a couple major, we'll again keep a high level strategies and key takeaways for you guys. Um, what I want to focus on is on sourcing, right? For years, supply chains were based on lowest cost, lean inventories, just-in-time deliveries to try to keep those warehousing and inventory costs down. But now there's a major shift in that. They are looking at stability, diversification, and flexibility, and that's something that we are really pushing from our end as well. On the diversification perspective, everyone's heard of the China plus one model. We're looking at China plus one, plus two, plus three strategies, right? And that is injected significant growth into major markets like Vietnam, India, Indonesia, Thailand, and Cambodia. On the Mexico front, it's seen significant growth, but that is nearshoring, that piece in the middle there. Um, Not so much full manufacturing transition, more so a portion, right? And especially for replenishment programs, speed to market categories, and fast moving SKUs, right? For those that have a shorter transit in logistics to get those products on the shelf, it is a strategy that is becoming more and more popular, and we are seeing more and more of that, but not a huge wave of shutting down factories and moving them to Latin America or Mexico. It's more a segment of it. And then, of course, multi-sourcing, right? Anytime one of those links in the supply chain breaks, you can have a major disruption. And so if you're avoiding dependency on single factories or single locations or single countries, that helps reduce the concentration of risk. The more spread out you have, the less impact of a major disruption. That does make you more susceptible to individual risks at the location level. But again, you can pivot from that if you have a large sourcing origin and something happens, that's going to be a major impact to your company. And so these three strategies are really the foundation of the modern supply chain resilience, which is something that we help with a lot of companies and their supply chains. And so to recap some of the priorities for 2026 and beyond, right? The big piece is build resilience. That previous slide that we just talked through, doing all of those aspects is really going to help protect you from those disruptions on a global scale. We talked about technology, really pushing and adopting technology and analytics to improve the operations of your company is critical. Investing in compliance and sustainability initiatives. We know that those are going to move forward regardless of how fast or how slow. But at the end of the day, early compliance is going to be a competitive advantage in the market. And last but not least, the basis for this entire presentation is plan for volatility. If you ever think there's going to be smooth sailing out there, right around the corner, always something happens. And there's an impact to the supply chain on the global scale, regional, or your individual company. Something always happens, but the best thing you can do is balance your long-term contract stability with some flexibility built in there. That's the best segue to manage uncertainty. So we are just about out of time. We do have some time for questions. Again, I want to thank the Accessories Council, Irene, Karen, thank you very much for having me on. My contact information is on there. You can scan that QR code and download that as well. on behalf of the Gemini Shippers Association, I want to thank you very much. If you have any questions, need input, need help on your ocean freight, please reach out. We can help wherever we can. We are also a not-for-profit, and so we help companies be a resource for that as well.
Thank you so much. I mean, this was incredible. I learned so much. I want to go back and kind of absorb a lot of it. I think it was truly, truly helpful, for all of us. And we value our relationship with Gemini Shippers tremendously. So I really appreciate you taking the time, to educate us all. So thank you for that. A lot of great takeaways. And we hope that we can do it again. So last time, anybody, any questions? I know you're getting a lot of applause, so that's a good thing.
Good.
So I see a lot of clapping hands there, but anybody? No, we have a quiet group. I think they're taking it all. I think they're like me. I'm still back like a couple of maps ago, just kind of figuring out how everything is. It's amazing we're
Uh,
getting anything. It's so
I
crowded.
actually I have a question for Roman. Roman, how are
Yep.
you? Great
Hey, how are
presentation.
you? Thank
Uh,
you.
I have a question. Should the situation in the Middle East improve, right? And since there's so much overcapacity in the market, what do you see the rates doing? You know, the fuel charges and everything that's happening with the global economy aside, what do you see the carriers doing with the rates?
Well, first and foremost, we talked about I don't want to say severe, but the overcapacity in the market. Long term, that's going to put pressure on the carriers to maintain rates where they are, right? So we would expect a lowering of those rates just from a demand perspective. What they do with the existing capacity and existing vessels is really the curveball there. We have not seen a lot of scrapping. So vessel scrapping is something that we pay attention to as they're removing that capacity from the market that does have a downline impact to the supply and demand curve. The problem is that the rate of new vessel deliveries versus scrapping, it won't catch up for a very long time. So
Right.
for a long-term view, we see those rates coming down. Like you mentioned, the oil is a big impact, and it was very abrupt. That's something that we'll see here for the next couple months. I mentioned this, but I'll reiterate the Strait of Hormuz, we don't expect that to be long-standing, right? If you're 120 days in that situation, or even 90 days, is a major, major impact to the global economy and some of those local economies. And at least from what we hear and understand, that's not what our administration is after. They're really trying to make an immediate impact here and make a change in that market. And so we hope that that gets resolved here in the next month or two. But the Red Sea will be one of those. That's the one that's ingesting a lot of those additional capacities. I can't see it being much longer than a year or so. In which case, assume there's no other disruptions like that. I would see the pressures of the market itself decreasing the rates overall.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Mhm.
Great. We'll have to do this again. I feel like there's like so much more to even still come. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, we can
thanks
go
everybody.
into a lot of detail. And Irene, I'll share the presentation via PDF with the group in case somebody asks for it. As always, you can reach out to me. I'll feel free to
Yeah.
share it, but from your perspective as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. And if anyone has any questions, we'll definitely direct them to you. So, but I think they've got all your information now, so that's good. So thanks,
Good.
everybody. Have a good rest of the night. Thanks again, Roman. And
Thank
we'll
you very
chat soon.
much.
Take care.